Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about quasi-experiments and small n designs. Over the past few weeks, we've talked a lot about experiments and experimental design, as well as the threats to validity, the things that might impact how we are going to interpret the outcome and the findings from a research study. And today we're going to talk about one version of an experiment called a quasi-experiment. And to understand what a quasi-experiment, we first need to understand what makes up a true experiment. Remember, we're trying to focus on determining some kind of causal inferences from whatever research we're doing. The correlation couldn't handle it, but the experiment can theoretically set up causal. And one of the elements necessary for the causal is to have good internal reliability. For us to have good internal reliability, we need two things. Those are to have manipulation of the variables and random assignment into the different conditions. So it's the researcher who needs to set up who's in each condition, and the researcher also needs to make sure that there's not some kind of selection bias about the makeup of those two groups that might bias and skew the results in some way. So again, focusing on this internal validity. A true experiment has both of these things. So the opposite of a true experiment is going to be a quasi-experiment. A quasi-experiment is when the researchers are unable to do one or both of these things. So whether they are unable to manipulate or unable to randomly assign participants into each condition. And this is usually due to practical or ethical considerations. There's just not possible to assign gender at birth. You can't manipulate that or randomly assign people into the different groups. If somebody gets sick from a disease, it's not ethical to give that disease to an individual versus not give it to some other individuals. So there's really a lot of variables out there where we can't manipulate them very specifically. The researcher has no control there. So instead, participants are assigned to the independent variable conditions by the environment, by teachers, political regulations, acts of nature, or even their own choice, that it's outside of the researcher's control. Some examples of the types of independent variables that might be used in quasi-experiments includes things like gender, where it is impractical and unethical to even attempt to assign gender to an individual. Maybe it's the history of bullying, where researchers can't assign someone to be bullied or not, and certainly there are different characteristics of individuals who are bullied or not that is some kind of selection effect that might bring them into a group or out of the bullying group. What about what we've talked about before with the Tuskegee syphilis exposure, where we found out it is very unethical to decide some people are going to have syphilis and some people aren't, or some people are going to get treated and some people are not. We have a lot of problems with that, and we can't necessarily determine who is going to get sick and who isn't. It's more naturally occurring, and we might not have the control over it. Or what about whether someone has been spanked in the past, whether their parents, maybe different generational characteristics there, or different parenting styles might be associated with this. And so all of these things, the researchers can't control. I keep saying that over and over again, and I want to reiterate, it is outside of the researchers' control, all of these variables. Of course, just because researchers don't have control over the different groups and can't randomly assign people to the different conditions doesn't mean we are uninterested in these variables. It doesn't mean we just throw it out. We do correlations even though we don't have causation. Well, a quasi-experiment, we are still going to look at these variables. We still want to know about how gender affects individuals, how a history of bullying might have different consequences, how parental spanking might lead to different outcomes. For instance, do children who are spanked act out more, or how are they as parents? Are they more aggressive to their children, or do they practice similar kinds of behaviors? We care about these variables, and so what we're going to do in a quasi-experiment is we're going to treat the independent variable that we cannot control and we cannot randomly assign, we're going to treat it as if we can. Now, always keeping in the back of our head that we can't, but we're going to treat it as if we can. So by treating these variables as if the researchers had some level of control, these studies are more feasible. We can still include them in our experiments, but there is a huge threat to internal validity because there's that absence of control and manipulation. The reason this is a problem is because something else might be the thing that is controlling who's in what condition or what conditions exist. There might be some other variable that's related to the IV and or the DV. Something else that is causing that connection between the two variables. So the cause and effect that we are so craving in an experiment, it's a lot harder to determine, right? We have those three elements, and internal validity is a major one for determining causation. So we want to, even more than we would in a true experiment, be focusing on these possible confounds, these other explanations that might be a threat to our validity and might be a threat to our interpretation of the outcome. So with that understanding of quasi-experiments as lacking manipulation and/or random assignment for these practical or ethical reasons, we're going to talk about a number of different types of quasi-experiments, what they look like, and how they are different from each other. The first type of quasi-experiment we'll talk about is a natural experiment. Natural experiments are a type of study in which individuals or groups are exposed to the experimental conditions as determined by nature or by other factors that are outside the control of the researchers. Natural experiments generally take advantage of events or policy changes that divide a population in a way that mimics random assignment. Because there's theoretically a low degree of systematic assignment conditions, this works. Assignment is happening naturally. When well designed, natural experiments can yield high causal inference, which offers strong evidence about cause and effect relationships in real-world contexts. And the key to a successful natural experiment is finding a situation where the assignment to the different conditions is as if random. This means that the event or policy change creates comparable groups that differ only in their exposure to the treatment, not in other factors that could bias the results. Natural experiments have been widely used in social science, in economics, and public health studies. For example, researchers have studied the effects of tornado exposure on mental health by comparing people in affected and unaffected areas, as long as we can assume that the tornado's path is random relative to other pre-existing conditions. Another classic example involves seatbelt laws, where researchers might compare traffic fatality rates before and after mandatory seatbelt laws across different states, and then researchers can estimate the law's impact. Similarly, winning the lottery has been used to study the effects of sudden wealth on long-term well-being, spending habits, and labor force participation, taking advantage of the randomness of lottery outcomes to isolate causal effects. Researchers conducting natural experiments aim to identify situations or groups where external events or policy changes affect one group but not another. This creates conditions similar to a randomized control trial. A crucial step in this process is ensuring that the groups being compared are similar in all relevant ways except for the treatment or exposure being studied. This comparability allows researchers to isolate the effect of the treatment from other confounding variables. To achieve this, researchers carefully select control groups that match the treatment group on factors such as demographics, socioeconomic status, environmental characteristics. They also apply statistical techniques to adjust for any remaining differences and strengthen the causal claims. For example, when studying the effects of mandatory seatbelt laws, researchers might compare traffic fatalities before and after the law's introduction in a populated area, like maybe LA. But it wouldn't make sense if they wanted to compare against a more rural area. To make valid inferences, we can't compare against a completely different environment, which differs in driving patterns, road infrastructure, and population density. Instead, researchers would look for comparably dense urban areas that didn't implement the law at the same time, such as maybe Washington, D.C. This is your comparison group. By comparing changes in traffic fatality rates over time in LA versus DC, assuming there was this seatbelt change, researchers can better isolate the effects of the seatbelt law from other factors that influence traffic safety. This careful matching enhances the credibility and validity of the natural experiment and helps to draw more accurate conclusions about policy impacts. Most variables, however, are not fully random, and there's some systematic way that people end up in different experimental groups of interest that is outside of the researcher's control. That is, people fall into different groups or categories based on other variables. Researchers may still want to examine the effects of being in those groups, but they are no longer considered natural experiments. A non-equivalent group design is instead what we're talking about. A non-equivalent group design is a quasi-experimental approach that's used when random assignment to treatment and control groups is not possible. In these designs, researchers compare outcomes between groups that already exist, such as maybe students in different classrooms, residents of different cities, that kind of thing. Because the groups are not randomly assigned, they may differ in important ways other than the treatment, which can introduce bias. Researchers using this design must account for these differences through careful group selection and statistical controls in order to try to isolate the effects of the treatment or intervention. And while it doesn't offer the same level of causal certainty as random experiments, because there's not this random, there's something systematic, it can still provide useful insights, especially when true experiments are impractical. And to give you an example of this, we're going to use a running example of the question, do people who are bilingual have better working capacity? Basically, if you know more than one language, are you better able to remember things because you're storing more words in your head, and maybe that helps train your brain to store more. And so we're going to have two variables, our independent variable and our dependent variable, as always. But this time our independent variable is this quasi-independent variable because we're doing a quasi-experiment. We are not manipulating or randomly assigning people to be bilingual or not, to know more language or not. There's something else that has resulted in people knowing more languages. But we're going to treat it as our independent variable because we are interested in whether knowing more languages is beneficial. And then we have our dependent variable, which is the working memory capacity. So I'm going to use that on the next couple of slides as our running example. So as a visual illustration, here we have the two conditions of the quasi-IV, the number of languages known. We have the monolingual subjects and the bilingual subjects. And again, there are other reasons why somebody might be in this besides random. It's not just suddenly you wake up one day and know another language. Obviously, there's some behavioral or environmental stimulus that is leading someone to know more than one language. So we have people in these different non-random conditions, but they are non-equivalent and they are different from each other. And of course, they're outside of the researcher's control, which makes it a quasi-experiment. And then we do a normal experiment thing where we take the two groups and we give them a dependent variable. We assess them on that outcome of interest, which in this case is the working memory test, and we see what their scores are. And maybe we get the scores on the working memory test, how many words they can remember. The monolingual subjects get a 3.2 and the bilingual get a 6.4. Oh, cool. We have evidence now from this quasi-experiment that the people who are bilingual can retain a little bit more information. But there's a question here that maybe it's just that the people who are bilingual knew those words already. They had some background experience with it. And so another version of a quasi-experiment might be a non-equivalent groups pre-test, post-test design, basically trying to figure out, can we figure out where people diverge before the assessment? So we might give a dependent variable, a measure of the dependent variable pre-test before people become their monolingual or bilingual. And so we can see that before anybody learned another language, everybody was scoring 3.4, but then later on in people's lives, when they became bilingual, suddenly we have a dependent variable outcome of a 6.4. So something about becoming bilingual through whatever means it happened, again, non-random, we see that the working memory improves. So another way of thinking about this in a practical method is maybe getting students who are young, haven't learned any other languages, haven't taken any language courses, haven't gone to other places to learn new languages, just assess children, see what their working memory is, and then later on through life, you can assess those who have become bilingual in the process of growing up through their history, and then assess whether working memory is different later. Again, we're trying to figure out, is there a change that is due to falling into one of these experimental groups that is outside of the researcher's control? That pre-test, post-test study that we just saw has an element of repeated measures design, but there's more ways you can do this repeated measures. So in quasi-experiments, there's a couple of more advanced repeated methods, such as the interrupted time series design. This is when you measure participants on the dependent variable repeatedly, both before, during, and after some event that's associated with the IV of interest. So in this case, we might take an individual and measure, while they are monolingual, we'll measure their working memory retention, and then when they learn another language, we then assess them as what is their working memory when they're bilingual. So again, here are each of the assessments flowing between each time point, and then there's that interruption, which is the learning a second language. We get their scores, and we can see from this example that, okay, they can remember some words, and then they become bilingual, and suddenly they're remembering a lot more words. That provides pretty strong evidence that there's something associated with number of languages known that affects the working memory. Of course, it might have been that just something else happened when they were learning the second language. There was some other history effect, some other threat to validity there that could have altered somebody's working memory. Maybe just after the second the assessment for working memory, all of the words clicked and they memorized them all and they can do this working memory test even better. We don't necessarily know. We have good evidence that it's the languages, but we don't perfectly know. And so another version is the interrupted time series with reversal. The idea being if we undo whatever brought somebody into an experimental condition, then the scores should return back to what they were before. So in this example, maybe they stop using their second language and they, they're not in the other country, or their family starts just speaking the single language, or they stop taking those courses. Whatever it was, they lose that, they lose access to the other language, and by all measures, they kind of revert to the monolingual. And then we would again assess them. This reversal where they go back to the original state, the original condition. And with the examples that I've given here for the outcomes, we can see that there is a new decline in working memory, suggesting that, or giving more evidence to suggest that something about being in the bilingual condition, the bilingual quasi-experimental condition, is associated with improved working memory. The third and final repeated measures quasi-experimental method is the non-equivalent control group interrupted time series. I know we're adding so many different terms. This is non-equivalent, means that there's different groups. This time we're adding a control group. So whenever we talk about a control group, it means there's somebody who is just business as usual. Things don't change. And then here we also have an interruption. There is something that is changing in the individual's experience, or at least in one group's experience. So here we have the same kind of group, this group 1, where they are monolingual until the interruption occurs and they become bilingual. But to make it different from the non-equivalent interrupted time series, to add that control group aspect, we have another group that never becomes bilingual. There is no interruption there. Business as usual. And so here we would see that the group 1, the one with the interruption, the working memory shifts, whereas the second group never shifts. So it's not just that people get smarter at word recall as they get older, as they retest. It's not just about testing effects where they get better at the word recall as time goes on. This suggests there's something about the bilingualness and the interruption that causes a bilingualness that is leading to word recall. And of course, we could always add a fourth variant on this with the reversal, doing the same thing where there's a new interruption that reverses and brings people back to the baseline, the original state, and we see how the scores change. So that group 1 looks the same as we saw in our reversal experiment, our reversal example on the earlier slide, but now our group 2 is giving us more evidence that nothing's really changing without that interruption. So this is providing, as we add more complex layers, whether adding repeated testing or adding a second control group or adding an interruption with a reversal, all of these are different tools that researchers can incorporate into their study. Now, this isn't always feasible to do all of these additional tools. I mean, it's kind of a stretch even here in this example to talk about people reverting to monolingualism. And you might be like, well, how often does that, people still retain some information and some understanding of their bilingual languages. So having a reversal isn't always practical. And having a control group in some situations isn't always practical. And having the ability to test people at a pretest or multiple times before an interruption may be impractical. So as researchers, you should be looking for opportunities and ways to incorporate these different tools where possible. And the situations and the variables that you are studying may allow for some and not allow for others, but that is the researcher's goal, is figuring out which one works in the situations that are available to you. So how do researchers find participants for these quasi-experiments? Well, one common strategy for creating these comparison groups is pre-screening, where participants are assessed on the independent variable of interest before the main study begins. It's pre the study. We're screening them to find how they score. So this method helps identify natural differences among individuals, such as maybe levels of narcissism or anxiety or self-control or multilingualism. This can then be used to form groups for further experimental testing. Pre-screening allows researchers to simulate the structure of an experiment by observing how people with different pre-existing characteristics respond to the same treatment or condition. A popular approach is to recruit from extreme groups. That means selecting individuals who fall into the bottom and top quartiles, so just the highest quarter of the group and the lowest quarter of a measured trait. For example, a study on narcissism might compare individuals with the highest and lowest narcissism scores to assess how that trait affects behavior under pressure. Another technique is the median split, where participants are divided into two groups based on whether their scores fall above or below the median, that middle point of the distribution. While this is easy to implement and ensures balanced group sizes, it can reduce the statistical power by lumping participants into only moderately different scores in the same category. The people who are close to that median are pretty similar to each other, and it just happens they're on one side or the other. It's also important to be cautious about regression to the mean when you're doing this, which is the tendency for extreme scores to move closer to the average over time, which can weaken the reliability of group differences in follow-up measurements. Of course, these methods are still good because they increase the sensitivity of the test because the contrast between any groups that you create is maximized. And regardless of which approach you take, these strategies allow researchers to approximate experimental conditions and to investigate interactions between personal characteristics and experimental treatments, thus offering valuable insights even without random assignment. The next type of quasi-experiment I want to describe is a person by treatment quasi-experiment. This is a design that examines how individuals with different characteristics can respond differently to the same treatment or intervention. Rather than comparing entirely separate groups, as in a non-equivalent groups design, this approach focuses on interactions between individual traits, such as personality, cognitive ability, or prior experience, along with the treatment condition. In other words, researchers are interested in a treatment. They are going to manipulate something, but they want to see whether this other measured variable influences the effect of their manipulation. And that other measured variable is a quasi variable. Again, those personality, cognitive abilities, or prior experience. Researchers typically measure these pre-existing traits, that second IV, and then observe how they influence the effects of the treatment, which is the manipulated IV. This design is useful when the goal is to understand for whom or under what conditions a treatment is most effective, which we've seen before, rather than whether the treatment just works overall, a main effect there. So for example, in studying a new drug for mood regulation, researchers might compare how depressed versus non-depressed individuals respond to the same medication. The goal is to understand whether the drug works better for certain types of people, revealing an interaction between personal characteristics and treatment effects. So you've seen a 2x2 factorial design, and that's exactly what a person by treatment is. One of the variables is the manipulated and one is the measured. It is a two-level, this one is a two-level, two levels in each independent variable for two independent variables. So we have the condition, the measured condition of depression and the measured condition of not depressed. We might pre-screen these variables. And then we have the treatment, the manipulated variable of whether they're taking an experimental drug or a placebo. And we are going to see how the Mood regulation is different depending on which group of the 4 conditions available the individuals fall in. We are manipulating one and measuring the other. And it's important here to note that this is all about statistical interactions. I said that already, but I want to reiterate that we are trying to see, are there different effects depending on the level of IV? So we might have a main effect interest, this overall question of, does the experimental drug make people feel better, help with mood regulation? But maybe we have the second situation. We know that there might be an interaction, that maybe it only works for depressed individuals. Maybe those who are depressed who take the drug might feel better with it, whereas those who are not depressed will just feel the same. The drug doesn't really help in any way. It's affecting parts of the brain that are only active or engaged when somebody is experiencing depression. So we want to manipulate the experimental drug versus placebo while measuring the depressed versus not depressed and find that interaction. It's very essential that you understood the multiple independent variables, the factorial design, to be able to understand this person by treatment. To illustrate how this might look visually, we start with a population, the sample that we're taking, and then we're going to divide them based on these pre-screened depression scores. We have to know where they fall. We're measuring this, and as we talked about, there's different ways. We could do a median split. We could do our extreme groups with the most depressed individuals versus the least depressed scores on a depression scale, but we're going to divide based on this pre-screened depression. Then we are going to randomly assign. This is now the researchers have a manipulation and some random assignment control. So we take from those 2 pre-screened groups in our measured independent variable and move them into 2 new levels of our manipulated independent variable. And then we measure their well-being, we measure their mood regulation after they've taken the drug for a certain period. So here we have our 2x2 person by treatment factorial design, looking at the measured variable of depression with the 2 levels of depressed versus not depressed, and then the manipulated variable of the treatment, which has the experimental drug versus the placebo conditions. And we are trying to find, as in all factorial ANOVAs, when we have more than one independent variable, we're trying to figure out if there are main effects and if there are interactions. So we are looking at how do the 4 different conditions here differ based on our dependent variables. So we have our mood regulation as it. So we might collect this data where we see in the placebo group, which is kind of like our control group. It's not a full control, but it's a control. We have that the individuals experiencing depression have poor mood regulation, whereas those not experiencing depression have high mood regulation in that control group. This is kind of what we'd expect. But when taking the experimental drug, we see that both groups are experiencing high degree of mood regulation. So what we're looking for is whether or not there are differences in the independent variable at the other levels, at different levels of the other independent variable. So is the difference between experimental drug and placebo in individuals who are experiencing depression different from the experimental drug versus placebo effects for those who are not experiencing depression? And here we see that there is a change there, that for those who are experiencing depression, the experimental drug seems to be having some effect, whereas for those who are not depressed, it's kind of business as usual regardless of whether they're taking the drug. Maybe this suggests that the drug is just not affecting the same parts of the brain, again, that might have something to do with depression. So this is a very important element, is by able to compare the different levels across different independent variables, those measured and manipulated, we can see that the treatment, the drug versus placebo, it really does matter these other characteristics of the population for explaining its effectiveness. And this design is great, and it provides some really useful insights, but I do want to be clear that it still faces some issues of internal validity we're going to talk more about in a second, particularly from selection effects. Pre-existing differences between the groups could confound the results, and in this case, it might be that depressed and non-depressed individuals may differ in other ways from what was already assessed by the researchers. For instance, the sleep patterns, physical health, or medication history may be different depending on whether an individual is experiencing depression, and this could influence the treatment's outcome. So these effects we're getting could be related to something else. So to reduce bias, researchers can use matched groups or statistical controls to account for these differences, which we talked a little about before, but there's always going to be this other consideration for how to interpret the information. So while not as strong as a randomized control trial, it still is good for helping to uncover for whom treatments are most effective and offering some valuable guidance for personalized approaches to interventions. Now that we've covered those types of quasi-experiments, I want to reiterate the most important part of understanding quasi-experiments, which is that internal validity aspect. As a reminder, internal validity refers to the degree to which a study can establish a causal relationship between the intervention and an outcome, free from any kind of confounding factors. In quasi-experiments, internal validity is always lower than in well-designed true experiments. Of course, there can be poorly designed true experiments that have high problems with internal validity, or I should say low internal validity. But a well-designed true experiment really helps to deal with internal validity, but a quasi-experiment just can't really do this due to the lack of random assignment and how that increases the risk of bias. True experiments use the randomization to evenly distribute unknown factors across the different groups, helping to ensure that differences in outcomes are due to the intervention alone. Without the safeguard of this random assignment, the quasi-experiments must rely on alternative strategies to approximate causal inference. So one major threat to this internal validity in quasi-experiments I just gave an example of, but it's the selection effects, which occur when groups being compared differ in meaningful ways before the intervention. There's this confounding variable of the non-equivalent groups, that the groups are not similar to each other, and that's why they're different. That's why we're measuring that they are experiencing depression, or why we're seeing that they are bilingual or not, or monolingual. So this is particularly problematic in non-equivalent group designs, where participants are not randomly assigned and may vary in baseline characteristics such as their age or income or motivation. And these pre-existing differences can confound the results, making it hard to tell whether observed effects are due to the treatment or to those underlying group differences. So to reduce the effects and impact of selection effects, researchers often use matched groups, which is a strategy where participants in the treatment and control groups are matched on key variables such as those age, gender, baseline performance. We talked about how DC and LA are better comparisons based on the population density than Nowheresville, USA. The driving habits are going to be very different when we are trying to understand traffic safety. This matching helps to improve the comparability, which means ensuring that groups are similar on all important variables except for the treatment itself. Although matching doesn't guarantee the elimination of all confounds, it is a valuable tool in quasi-experimental design, and it can bring the study closer to the rigor of a randomized experiment. Another useful approach is the wait list design, in which all participants eventually receive the treatment, but one group just has to receive it later than the other. There is a wait in this process. This allows the earlier group to serve as a temporary control. So at that second time point, we see that one of them has gone bilingual, but the other is still monolingual. And this helps to isolate the effect of the treatment during that time difference. But since both groups are ultimately going to be exposed to the same condition, this bilingual in this example, they may be similar in motivation or willingness to participate in the study. This design improves internal validity by reducing some selection biases, because everybody kind of has the same motivation and the same end result. Nonetheless, even with these strategies, quasi-experiments require this careful interpretation and awareness of the limitations of internal validity. It's a common issue in all kinds of quasi-experiments that you're going to read in your research, that the future directions or the limitations, internal validity is a huge one that is discussed. So keep that in mind whenever you are reading an experiment where there is a measurement of the variable. Maybe it's gender that's being explored. That's a quasi-experimental independent variable. And so you want to take that into account. What are some other things that might be different between these groups because they were not randomly assigned? In many research situations, especially in quasi-experimental designs, achieving perfect comparability between the groups is difficult. A single comparison group often isn't enough to confidently determine whether an observed effect is due to the variable of interest or to some other factor. There may be multiple potential confounds. Those are variables that could provide alternative explanations for the findings. When this happens, researchers can't rely on a simple two-group design and need to take additional steps to rule out other explanations for their results. To address this, researchers use what's known as a patched-up design, where they add additional control or comparison groups in order to test for the influence of specific confounding variables. Each added group serves to eliminate another possible alternative explanation, gradually strengthening the internal validity of the study. For example, if a study finds that students who use study guides perform better on exams, it's unclear whether the guide itself caused the improvement or if those students were simply more motivated. By adding more conditions, such as a group given the guide but not required to use it, or a group given a different kind of aid, researchers can better isolate the true effect of the study guide. Patched-up designs help build a more complete and credible explanation when clean comparisons aren't possible from the start. But let's see how that works in an example. We're going to build out this study guides effective question. So we're going to start with the most basic way to understand this question about whether study guides are effective. Let's do just a one-group design. We talked about this before as being a pseudo experiment. So we'll take a sample, we'll give them a study guide, so all of you get a study guide, and then the final grade is a 90% average. This is a pseudo experiment because we don't have any comparison groups. We've simply said, here's something I'm doing, and I want to see what the outcome is. But we don't know if that final grade outcome was due to the study guide or just random chance that people got that. Maybe the study guide actually made things worse. Maybe everybody would have gotten a 95% average if it weren't for the study guide. So the results of this show it's a 90% on the final exam with a study guide. But again, what if the guide was unnecessary? So instead, we're going to do a little bit more proper of a research. Let's do a one-group pre-test, post-test design. This is our first attempt at patching up. We are trying to build off of our original finding and do one step more complicated. So in this one, we're going to have a sample and we're going to give them a pre-test, which has no study guide. So maybe we'll just take the midterm grade. That's an 82%. And then we give them the study guide and we see how that manipulation affects our dependent variable post-test. So that's the final grade. And we see there was an 8% increase over the course of that study guide. So we might take this to interpret that shift from an 82 without the study guide to a 90% with the study guide. That improvement was due to the study guide. But of course, there's other interpretations here. What about testing effects? Maybe just learning how the professor gives the midterm and writes a test can help to improve grades. People know what kinds of things to study or how to answer those multiple choice or short answer questions in the most effective way. So it might not be the study guide at all. So let's do another patched up example. Let's do one step more complicated. So let's patch it up with a post-test only design with non-equivalent groups. Try to answer this question newly. And we're going to take a sample of a previous semester versus a future semester that had a study guide or didn't. So this researcher might have taught a course where there was no study guide available previously, and now they are including a study guide. And they're going to see that the course before, when there was no study guide, the final grade was an 84%. But in this new course where the professor, the researcher tried to include a study guide, suddenly students are scoring a 90%. So it would look like that 6% difference is due to a study guide. But maybe there was something systematic about the two groups. We should note that this was a non-equivalent groups, which you might have recognized as a type of quasi-experimental design. And that's because the researcher is not randomly assigning individuals to either course. the students are choosing to be in the course last semester versus the new semester. Maybe there's something systematic about the types of students or the notoriety of the professor or the time the class is held. So maybe last semester, the previous semester, the course was at 8 a.m., in which case, I don't know about you, but I have a little bit trouble focusing and absorbing information at 8 o'clock in the morning. Whereas if the new semester is at a different time, maybe 4 p.m. when people are past their afternoon slump and they're excited for the end of the day, but they're ready to focus and get the last information, maybe they absorbed it a little bit different. So it might not be the study guide because there's no random assignment and there's no clear manipulations here. There's something else systematic that might be going on that is affecting the internal validity. So let's patch it up again and see maybe there's something about the course and the timing of the course or the attention span of the students. So this time we're going to do a pre-test, post-test with non-equivalent groups to see if we can figure out, were students in the last semester just generally performing worse than the students in the new semester? So we take last semesters, and this time we're going to look at the midterm grade and see that they had a 78% before the final, and then at the final they got an 84, and there was no study guide at all. So they have about a 6% increase. But then this semester, they have an 82%, then a study guide, and then 90. So that looks like an 8% increase. We see evidence that, yeah, the new semester was doing a little bit better already. And so they're only doing a little bit better with the study guide. That improvement isn't necessarily a 6%. It's just really a 2%. Right? It's a 6% increase due to testing effects in last semester, and now it's an 8% increase. So that's going to have some testing effects and something else. Maybe that 2% is the study guide. So we look at this and say, oh yeah, we're seeing some effects, maybe it matters, but what about experimenter bias? Maybe the fact that the professor is including a study guide, they're just going to teach harder and try to make sure they really prove their point. So you can see how this keeps going. And that is a patched up design. That is the necessary understanding, is that we are always looking at a previous design saying, what is one interpretation of this that could be different? What is one threat to internal validity and interpretation? And how can we use a different design to answer that question or to rule out that interpretation? Sometimes patched up designs are just about measuring the pre-screening and measuring how participants are at that pre-test to see how do they shift over time, trying to rule out some of those testing effects or mere measurement or reactivity. We talked a little bit about social desirability, and maybe you want to measure social desirability to see, are people reacting to doing whatever is wanted by the researcher or not. So there's lots of different ways we can patch up, but it's about taking one experiment and modifying it with a new design. Now, as we're talking about quasi-experiments, some of you might have noticed that this feels a lot like a correlation study. We're just finding the relationship between two variables. Without an experimental control, without that manipulation, it looks a lot like a correlation where we can't do cause and effect. So the short answer to this, and at first glance, quasi-experiments might indeed seem like fancy correlational studies. They both examine relationships between variables without full random assignment, and in a sense, it's true. Quasi-experiments, like correlational studies, involve in observing what naturally occurs rather than manipulating variables under tightly controlled conditions. Because of this, they share the core limitation of being vulnerable to confounding variables, which makes it harder to draw firm causal conclusions. However, there is a long answer. Quasi-experiments go a step beyond basic correlations by actively trying to rule out alternative explanations and establish temporal precedents. This is the idea that one event clearly happens before another. For example, in a quasi-experiment, studying the effects of a new school policy, researchers might compare student performance before and after the policy is introduced, or use matched comparison groups to account for the pre-existing differences. These added design features help to improve internal validity and make causal inferences stronger than they would in a simple correlational study, even if it's not as strong as in true experiments with random assignment. So we have different levels of design that we can use to establish causation, with correlation being basically the worst version, and then a true experiment being the best. So now that we've talked about all these different quasi-experimental designs, what happens if only a few people have experienced the thing that you want to study? Well, when researchers are interested in a rare experience or unique condition that only a few individuals have encountered, traditional large-scale sample designs may not be practical or informative. In these cases, small N designs offer a powerful alternative. Rather than collecting a small amount of data from a large number of people, small N designs involve gathering a large amount of detailed information from a small group of participants. This approach allows researchers to closely track individual patterns of behaviors, thoughts, or changes over time, which can be especially valuable when studying rare phenomena or personalized interventions. A particularly focused form of small N research is the single N design, often referred to as a case study. In this method, a single person's experience is studied in depth, often through repeated measurements across different conditions or over time. Single N designs are commonly used in clinical psychology, neuropsych, medical research, where a unique patient case can reveal important insights about diagnosis, treatment response, or the functioning of a specific cognitive process. Now, in many cases, small N designs can be true experiments if the researchers are indeed randomly assigning only a few participants to a specific manipulation. This is often due to practical limitations such as financial costs or the availability of suitable patients. For instance, studies of specialized drugs for epileptic patients requires not only a sample of patients who experience epilepsy and are willing to participate in a study with a specialized drug, but also advanced technologies such as EEG or fMRI for measuring neural response to the treatment. Often, however, these small N designs fall into the category of quasi-experiments, given researchers are not manipulating the single individual's experience. It's often some unique extreme. For instance, the classic case study of Phineas Gage involved a man who had a rod puncture his frontal lobe, something that would be highly unethical for any researcher to manipulate on a subject. And also, many of Sigmund Freud's work is also based on his observations of unique cases, patients who sought out his care for unique mental health issues. There's some systematic bias of who even came to him. And in fact, this quasi-experimental nature of Freud's work and the resulting issues of internal validity and interpretation are a primary major concern of his when it comes to criticisms of his work and theories, and why a lot of psychologists, modern psychologists, tend to dismiss some of his ideas in preference for more modern interpretations of similar phenomena. The types of small N designs that we're going to talk about are going to look very similar to those quasi-experimental designs. The first is a stable baseline design where you are assessing the dependent variable repeatedly and then introducing a treatment or event. You could see this as synonymous with the interruption style. Anytime you have an event that occurs to the individual and then suddenly you measure the outcome afterwards, even though the researcher was not manipulating that treatment, event, or interruption that did happen, and the researcher is just assessing the outcome. So you might have an individual who is feeling great, happy all the time, very positive with the coworkers, and then suddenly something happens. You get an interruption of maybe a rod jammed up through the head, and then suddenly personality change. And this is what was reported with Phineas Gage, that he was an ostensibly really nice, friendly guy, and then after this, his personality completely changed, and he was angry and reactive, made a lot of poor decisions. And this is kind of how we understand, or one of the original studies to understand how the frontal lobe plays a role in decision making and personality. Now, it is ideal if you can get multiple baseline measures. Instead of just one person saying, oh yeah, he was a good guy before and now he's not so happy. Well, it's nice to have a lot of people say, yes, he was good before and he was nice for a long time. He wasn't this angry person until after the interruption, until after that treatment. So that enables us to see that there's some baseline continuity in the individual that we can hypothetically see as changing after the fact. This reduces concerns about just people grow and maybe there's a regression to the mean. Maybe he just reached a point in his life when he just decided to be angry, or maybe he was actually not a really happy guy. He just kind of looked happy for a while because he liked his new job or something. These maturation regression, the mean threats to validity, are removed or somewhat reduced in this interpretation. Similar to the quasi-experimental, we can also do a reversal design. This is when we take those baseline measures, we assess after the interruption, after that treatment, but then we can remove the treatment. So maybe we can remove the rod and repair the frontal lobe. They weren't able to in the 1800s, but theoretically maybe that could happen. There could be some kind of surgery to improve and then see if personality returns back to baseline. So this interruption and reversal design is the same in a small n design. It's just called something different, stable baseline versus reversal. Some advantages of the small and single n designs are the ability to collect rich, detailed data on individual participants, which allows researchers to closely examine behavior or outcomes over time. This makes small n designs especially useful in clinical or applied settings where personalized interventions or rare cases are being studied. Another benefit is that small n designs do not require data to be aggregated across participants, which means that researchers can observe meaningful patterns and effects within a single person. This avoids the risk of group averages making individual differences disappear, masking them. Small n designs also offer tight experimental control and repeated measurement, which establish the cause and effect relationships at the individual level. However, small n designs can also have some notable limitations. The lack of generalizability is a key drawback. Findings from one or a few individuals cannot easily be extended to the broader population. These designs are also more susceptible to individual variability, which can make it difficult to interpret results or to compare across different studies. In addition, small n studies typically have lower statistical power compared to the large n designs, making it harder to detect subtle effects. Despite these trade-offs, though, small n designs are a valuable tool for exploring unique phenomena, refining theories, and understanding individual level processes in depth. Well, all right, that's a wrap on quasi-experiments and small n design. Remember, just a true experiment has that manipulation and random assignment to help with internal validity, and a quasi-experiment and these other designs just don't. They cannot or should not, because of practical or ethical reasons, do any kind of manipulation or random design, but we still are interested in these variables, and so we have to use these other methods and other ways of interpreting, and always coming at them with the idea that there are challenges to internal validity, and how might we patch up our designs to help answer those issues of internal validity. That's it for this week. See you again. Bye.